back to tonight. Our lecture will run for approximately 50 minutes, and then we'll have a few minutes at the end for some questions. When I stand up and give the signal, we'll have to retire to the snacks and ask questions there, but hopefully we'll all get our questions in. Our guest speaker this evening is Dr. Libby Bischof, the Executive Director of the Osher Map Library and Smith Center for Cartographic Education. Is also a professor of history at the University of Southern Maine. She received her bachelor's, master's, and PhD from Boston College. She has written many articles and 2 award-winning books: Maine Photography and History, 1840 to 2015, winner; 2017 Historic New England Honor Book Prize; and Maine Moderns, Art in Seguinland, 1900 to 1940. She has curated exhibitions both on her own and with her students, and has done important work in digital and public history projects. She is the winner of Maine Economic Improvement Fund Grant for her project, an interactive website mapping World War I memorials in Maine, a centennial project to inventory and document Maine's participation in and memorialization of the Great War. Tonight, Dr. Bischof will be focusing on a topic that is fascinating and entirely new to me: maps like I've never thought of them. After the American Revolution, dozens of academies to educate young women opened up throughout Maine and New England. Geography was a different aspect of education in 19th century America. Dr. Libby Bischof will discuss the fascinating and understudied genre of schoolgirl maps. Young women drew, copied, embellished maps, atlases, and globes. These decorative manuscripts reveal much about the education of women in 19th century New England and the personal and family histories of the individual young women who crafted the maps. I'm certainly looking forward to hearing what our guest has to say about all this. Please welcome Dr. Libby Bischof.
Thank you, friends. I'm pretty informal. Feel free to call me Libby. I'm loud also, so I might just step away from that a little bit. So schoolgirl maps, which we'll get into in just a second, but just hearing about everything that you're doing with textiles and seeing Peter here, on June 30th, we will close our current exhibit at the Osher Map Library, which is mapping New England's textile history. So if you haven't been up, come on up and check out a whole host of fire insurance maps, beautiful city views of Maine, Massachusetts, and beyond. So everything, there's a lot of textile history going on all over. Pajebska's doing something right now up in Brunswick with textile history. So the Maine Mill Museum just rebranded from Museum LA. So there's a lot of really nice textile stuff going on that you fit right into. So I've been at USM for 16 years. I've been directing the Osher Map Library for the past 5. And one of the interesting things about my job, there are many interesting things about my job, but we purchase a lot as well. So not only do we have very generous donors who have donated their collections to the library, we have about 500,000 maps dating back to 1475. It's an incredible public collection. We are wholly mission-driven for educational outreach. We saw 200 university classes this year. We'll see 6,000 K through 12 kids by the end of the year. So one of the things that we also do is buy maps to augment the collection. And so our collecting priorities right now are maps made by women, maps made by people of color, and also maps that show indigenous land possession and dispossession. I could buy maps made by women for the rest of my life and never achieve any kind of parity in the collection. Male cartographers have dominated the field since its existence, which doesn't mean that women aren't making maps, but we sometimes just have to look in different places. So I created a show pre-pandemic, so definitely a few years ago now, called Mapping the Classroom, that looked at the role of geography and mapping in education in New England. And this work on schoolgirl maps is a bit of an offshoot from that. I'm a historian, I'm an educator. You're more likely to find me either in an archive teaching or outside teaching. When I teach history of Maine, we're almost never in a classroom. We're always learning from the built environment. My colleague and I just took 10 USM students to Alabama and Georgia for spring break for a 10-day class on slavery and mass incarceration, thinking about history and memory. So we're always doing things on site and hands-on. So it's no surprise to myself anyways that I'm deeply interested in schoolgirl maps because they're very hands-on. I wanted to read you just a bit of an essay that was written by Virtue Howard. She was a teacher, and on April 8th, 1870, she actually won an essay contest that was run by the Oxford, Maine Democrat. Newspapers in the 19th century were politically driven, so you often see Republican or Democrat in newspaper titles. So she makes this argument to her fellow residents of Oxford County and also to other teachers that geography and history should be inseparable companions. After reciting the lesson, I often employ someone of the class to take the map pointer. Notice that she's saying a special tool just for going up and pointing at the map, telling you that she has a large map, at least one in her classroom. And in selecting different places, I connect them with fragments of history. For instance, the island of St. Helena with Napoleon Bonaparte, Juan Fernandez, with Alexander Selkirk, etc. Something of the novel and marvelous should be connected to render them forcibly presented to the mind. Another method I have practiced of having the pupils draw on their slates or blackboard the outline of some prominent features of the earth. To make a map of your own town and then attach the neighboring ones is a very fine idea. Recently, I've taken even my alphabet class, the kindergartners, and taught them the town, county, and state, drawn them into a little geography class by pointing out and naming the mountains, rivers, islands, valleys, peninsulas, etc., all within their own view. And when possible, we take a little walk with them, and we render it as pleasant as possible by chatting in a very familiar manner. It has wonderfully pleased my little charges, and has well paid me for my toil, but I've always tried to render it romantic. As I often witness with regret that many of my older pupils leave the study of geography when they ought not. And having no history in many schools, I devised a method of giving out 1 or 2 questions to be remembered by all the capable years, to be reported the next morning. I commenced with the creation, and from period to period, bringing it to our own time, until from time to time with geography. Thus I have what I call a general class, from the oldest even to the youngest pupil connected. What she's doing is experiential, site-based education. These are the methods that schools are trying to employ now in 2023 to re-engage students. And she's doing them in 1870. And she's following a trajectory that becomes pretty common after the Civil War, in that prior to the 1850s, when students were learning geography, they started with the world and worked in to where they live. And then after, in the 1860s and 70s and beyond, they literally start by mapping their classroom and work their way out. And it's a distinctive pedagogical shift. So I like thinking about the way in which Virtue Howard pairs history and geography together, but she's not the only one that's doing this. Most students in the 18th and 19th centuries, and even into the early 20th century, and I will be very curious to hear from you at the end how many of you did map drawing in class, that it was the most common way to learn geography, was to have students draw maps. You see it a little bit now, not to the same extent. We do run an annual map-making contest. This is the last week of it for Maine 4th, 5th, and 6th graders, and we'll have a few hundred entries from around the state. But they're mostly making maps of imagined places. There was a beautiful one of a map of Corgiana that came in today, that was in the shape of a corgi, or a very sweet map of where to pet my dog. So they're very clever, the things that they come up with. But in the 1800s, schoolgirls, particularly schoolgirls, I'll talk about schoolboys, I won't leave them out, it's a different curriculum though. Schoolgirls are making these massive, elaborate, highly detailed maps. And so this is our largest one that we have at the Osher Map Library, and the first one that we got, this is one that Dr. Osher purchased. And I've purchased probably, well, we won't talk about how many more I've purchased. Many. Whenever I can, I buy these. I drove up the market. It's actually terrible. I priced myself out of it. But they're amazing to have. So this map was made in 1820. It is much bigger than this screen. So it's funny in looking at this, like the screen doesn't actually do it justice, because the map is actually larger than the way in which you see it on screen. It's actually 6 sheets of paper made together. Every element of this map is hand-drawn. The cartouche around her name and the title of the map is filled with flowers. It is particularly featuring pink carnations. And these maps were a way, and we'll talk a lot about them tonight, these maps were a way for young women to practice their penmanship, their drawing, to learn their geography and their history, but also to work on their artistic rendering as well. So they brought in all of these different elements into one assignment. And so the flowers often mean something, right? So they're not just accidental. So pink carnations are "I will never forget you," or sometimes representative of a mother's love. And so we don't actually know where Emily Hill made this map. Oftentimes the young women will sign not only who they are and when they made it, but where they were when they made it, and you'll see that with some other examples. But what's interesting is that we do know the map that Emily Hill was using. So she was drawing her 1820 map from Osgood Carleton's 1806 new map of the United States. And one of the reasons that we know that is because if you can see not just the title on here, but the compass above, the compass is exactly the same. So she is making a rendering, a much more colorful rendering, of Osgood Carleton's very rare map. So Osgood Carleton's 1806 is actually a very hard 19th century map to get. So in thinking about these academies, which we'll do tonight, and in thinking about the ways in which these women are copying the maps and making them their own, I want to first talk a little bit about the visual culture of late 19th and early 20th century New England classrooms. What do I mean by visual culture? Just everything you see around you. So what does it feel like to be in a 19th century New England classroom? Right? What does it look like? What's around you? And I'm a photo historian by trade. I work a lot on maps now. Accidental, but enjoyable. But one of the things I wanted to do when I curated this show, which people hadn't really done before, is in thinking about maps in the classroom, I wanted to see what photography would tell us. Are there photographs of interior classrooms from the 19th century, and what kind of maps do they show? So this is a Shaker School in Massachusetts in the 1890s, and you can see that to the left of the teacher is a large globe, and you can see that behind her is a very large wall map, right? And so the more we look, the more we see evidence. This is a grammar school in Medfield, Massachusetts in 1886. You can see Mitchell's new outline map of Africa and the hemispheres on the back wall of the classroom, with Longfellow also looming over the students. And what's written on the blackboard are actually the names of all of the students sitting in the class. And if you saw a close-up of this classroom, it's so funny because kids have not changed since the 1880s. There's every possible expression. Someone's rolling their eyes, someone has their things crossed, someone's not looking, like they really didn't want to get this picture taken. But I'm looking for the maps, and most of the maps you're going to see in 19th century classrooms were made by Samuel Augustus Mitchell. And so many of the teachers who used map making in their classrooms or had maps in their classrooms had been, like you can hear from Virtue Howard, like unsatisfied with what either the curriculum had to offer or the tools they could get for their classroom. So Mitchell knew that he wanted to use maps in his classroom. He wasn't satisfied with what was on the market. So he started as a school teacher in Connecticut, but became a very prominent Philadelphia map publisher later in his life. And so he invented the system of outline maps for the classroom, and he is not humble, and argued that his outline maps would be to the study of geography what the exercise on the blackboard is to the science of numbers, and that knowledge communicated to the mind through vision produces the most vivid and lasting impression. And this is really what you're saying. This is how I learned, so it doesn't come as a surprise to me. But if you want students to learn geography, you have to surround them with it. So if you have all of these maps all over the classroom, like never mind the individual exercises they were doing, like Virtue Howard described, But also think about the fact that they're just always there. And when students are staring out the window or looking around or distracted, they're looking at a map. They're still seeing it. And so Mitchell made all of these outline maps. These are two that we have in our collections. Here's one of Maine. You can see it's number 5 and number 6 of New Hampshire and Vermont. And they're outline maps. So the idea is that they're not actually labeled, because you would stand up with the map pointer in the classroom and you would go through and say, this is this college, this is this river, this is this mountain, this is this capital city, eventually this is this railroad. And so you would learn the geography by literally pointing it out, and then also by drawing it. And so taken together, you can really start seeing how this system worked. This is the first building of the Western State Normal School, or the Gorham Normal School, which is the predecessor institution of USM where I teach. Normal schools were for training teachers. They were post-secondary institutions. And so these photographs, the building was built in 1870 and these photographs were taken in 1880. And what's really interesting to see about the recitation rooms, where they're teaching the teachers and also bringing in local young students for student teaching practicums, that the recitation rooms all have maps, they have globes. If you look at the practice school for the lower grammar school, there's a wooden cutout of the state of Maine in the back right corner. The Mitchell map of the hemispheres is the same map that was hanging in the Medfield Grammar School classroom. And so you start to see in Maine, in Massachusetts, in Connecticut, elsewhere, all of these institutions have these very similar maps. So how else do we know students are learning geography? This is the West Street School in Portland, Maine. There are map drawings on the chalkboard. The West School was in Libby Town in Portland. This is a school in Brooklyn, Maine. So you can see, I'll show you a close-up in a second, where you can see the students have a lot of visuals. There's a map in the back corner. The words that are sort of traveling, like little sayings for the students, say wisdom is strength, knowledge is power, and dare to do right, which are not that different from what you see in schools today. But I wanted to point out the huge Statue of Liberty print. It's massive. It's because, and this is from 1900, but the Statue of Liberty is erected and dedicated in 1886. But it's in so many schoolrooms, and I'll show you another one, is because Joseph Pulitzer held a fundraising drive to build the base of the Statue of Liberty, and it was mostly school kids who actually raised the pennies to make that happen. So here is the print. It was a very colorful Currier and Ives print, Liberty Enlightening the World. And this is the one that was hanging in that classroom in Brooklyn, Maine. This is Kennebunk, Maine. I'm just going to get my water. And it has the Kennebunk has the same print. Right? So the more you look at these, you start seeing that school kids all over New England, and by water I mean Diet Coke. But you start seeing that school kids all over New England are seeing the same things surrounding them, and it's part of their common curriculum. This is a classroom in Hiram, Maine, very rural Hiram, Maine. And you're not seeing a map, but you are seeing the geography lesson written out from the textbook on the blackboard, the questions that they were actually answering. And this is not just in Maine and New England. We find evidence at the Tuskegee Institute in Alabama in 1902. You can see that the students are learning geography. You can see the map on the back chalkboard. This is a class in mathematical geography studying the Earth's rotation at the Hampton Institute in Hampton, Virginia. You can see that the students all have globes in front of them and are learning about the rotation up on the blackboard. And you continue to see this. This is one of my favorites. This is in New York City in 1908. And you can see that the students are staring into stereographs and stereoscopes and seeing geography in 3D. This image has a bird's eye view map on the back wall. It has a globe in it. So globes, maps, visualization of place is ubiquitous in classrooms in the turn of the century. So what about these schoolgirl maps? If you get interested in them, there are many things to read, but mostly by one historian my friend and colleague Susan Schulten, who teaches at the University of Denver. She has a great article in the History of Education Quarterly about map drawing, but I like the way that she frames it here. Whether you're stitching a map of Boston Harbor in 1800 or painting a double hemispheric map of the world in 1825, generations of young girls, and more than a few boys, turn towards the language of cartography to learn history, geography, penmanship, and place. And so she argues that the map becomes an instrument of literacy itself. So let's go into this world of what students are actually learning and put this in context, especially for young women. So one of the other types of materials that we've been buying to kind of put the schoolgirl maps in context, because we have such a large collection of them, are other things that young women were making from the same schools at the same time. And a few years ago, we had the opportunity to purchase a really remarkable small archive. So it's common that we have one thing made by one young woman. Even that's remarkable. Women's history is recovery work, right? Not everybody keeps a diary, not everybody writes letters, and not all families save it. So we actually have 6 pieces that Abigail Bishop Putnam of Danvers, Massachusetts, made over time. So 6 years of her work to see how she developed. It's extraordinarily unusual. This is the crowning piece. This is from June of 1905, and it's called On Virtue and On Sympathy. And if you saw this in person, you would see all of her delicate, delicate hand-colored work. So the columns appear as if they're in 3D. She drew all of those. She drew the bower of flowers. And she's practicing at least 4 different hands of penmanship in this exercise, signing it Abigail Bishop Putnam of Medford. And we think that she studied at Susanna Rowson's Academy in Boston, but Susanna Rowson briefly had it in Medford between 1800 and 1803. And one of the things, if you look at this and if you touch it, the paper is hand-laid. It's a very expensive piece of paper that you wouldn't necessarily be giving to just any young woman. And so looking at these maps and the women who were able to pay to get educated in this way, especially before public high schools came into being, it tells you something of the stature of their families, right? What their fathers did, that their fathers believed in educating them. Because even if their mothers believed in educating them, it didn't mean that they would get educated, because their mothers weren't paying for it, not in the early 1800s. Abigail Bishop Putnam, her mother was Abigail Adams's niece. Her father, Archelaus Putnam, great name, someone needs to bring that back, was both a doctor and a Harvard graduate. So she had the money, she had the means to do this, and she's able to continue like the practice of her penmanship. So to understand these schoolgirl maps, you have to understand that this is also what these young women were doing at the same time. So from the same place, from Medford, Massachusetts, just 5 years after Putnam makes her penmanship exercise, we purchased Mary B. Hall's Map of the World from the latest discoveries. She also was a student at Mrs. Rowson's Academy. This map is spectacular in person. It's all pen and ink and grisage, gray watercolor, before that's even popular. And what these young women are doing is that they're often copying the maps. So the earliest ones you'll see are global. They're world maps, right? Dual hemisphere world maps. After the War of 1812, they become more about the United States, which is really just interesting historically. But she's copying the map. She's putting in all of the latitude and longitude lines, right? Rivers, cities, countries, states. But she's also writing the title, having the sheaves of wheat. And it's really interesting that the young women, they sign these maps in very different ways. Sometimes they say rendered by, sometimes they say copied by, sometimes they say drawn by. It's how they're imagining their own kind of self-fashioning through this work. So this is Mrs. Rowson. She opens actually the first academy for young ladies in Boston in 1797. If you ever read Charlotte Temple, She's the stage actress and novelist that wrote Charlotte Temple. But when she retired from the stage at age 35, which would have been ancient in the early 1800s, she started a school for young women, and it was in Medford and then Newton and then permanently in Boston. And she taught until 1822, just 2 years before her death. She wrote a textbook called Youth's First Steps in Geography. And so it's no surprise to learn that her students were making maps. But her students were also drawing pictures of the school. So this is what the school looked like on Boston Neck. It's later the Washington House. This is done in 1808, in the early years of her school. And so you see that this is a refined academy for young women. And the things that the women who can afford to go there produce are really spectacular. So women are not just drawing and painting maps, they're also sewing maps on silk as samplers. And so this map of Boston Harbor, worked by Sally Dodge at Mrs. Rowson's in Medford, February 27th, 1800. And so we actually know, because she signed all of that as part of this map. So this is hyperlocal. She's in Medford, she's studying Boston Harbor, she's stitching all of this. So she's practicing both her fine and fancy needlework, her embroidery, and also her geography at the same time. But think about how carefully you would learn all of the Boston Harbor islands if you had to stitch each one and then stitch in their names. Like, it's just going to be committing it to memory over and over again. This isn't just happening in New England. This is a spectacular map sampler. This actually comes from Alexandria, Virginia. This young woman, Elizabeth Graham, who made this, it's at the Winterthur in Delaware. She was 10 to 13 when she created this. So these women are often very young when they're doing this. But this is a 3-year project. So you can see L'Enfant's layout of Washington, D.C., just not long after he had made that layout, and then all of the embellishments of the leaders, the monuments, and all of the same floral decorations you see on these maps. So they're drawing them, they're sewing them, but then they're also producing these really interesting copybooks. The earliest one we know about in Maine is actually at Maine Historical, and it's Lucia Wadsworth's, Henry Wadsworth Longfellow's sister. So this was done in not her sister, his mother. And give me a second on that one. This is Lucia Wadsworth. So it was found in the house when Maine Historical got it. It is spectacular. I mean, this is 1794, and this is her homeschooling. She's not going to an academy. This is her mariner's compass. This is her rendering of the solar system. These are the maps that she draws. And not only does she draw specific maps, she also begins to define what maps are. And the way in which she copies that definition is saying that a map exemplifies any part of the surface of the earth, the geographical divisions of land and water delineated with their established names affixed. And so she's saying what you might find is a coast, a river, lakes, villages, towns, islands, etc., mountains, chief cities. And so she's even defining the discipline as she's copying these things. We have many of these books. This is Caroline Burroughs's 1809 book. This is unreal. So there are 18 hand-drawn, folded-in maps in her copybook. They start with the United States and they work inward. They are all from different atlases. So she's not even just looking at one atlas or one book to make this. She is studying a whole variety of them. And one of the things I wanted to show you, and I'll show you her District of Maine map, turn the right way in a minute, is that they're also, the way in which they're drilling this geography with these copybooks is also in their word maps. So when you look at the District of Maine and she's giving the Maine facts about the District of Maine, she's also showing you what Maine is bordered by on each side. Canada, the Atlantic, New Hampshire. So they're even practicing the geography as they write in the copybook. And so you're constantly having these visual reminders of the states and their borders. So we know that she is copying the map of the District of Maine from Samuel Lewison's Province of Maine from the best authorities in 1794, which was in the American edition of Guthrie's Geography Improved. So we can look at atlases that we have and textbooks and try to determine where the young women are copying these maps from. And they differ wildly, but you can see, I mean, you can clearly look at it and see that this is what she is copying. I mean, especially if you look at the compass on the bottom. You can really see that that's where she's deriving that from. So this is Catherine M. Cook's Book of Penmanship at Mr. Dunham's School in Windsor, Vermont, June 15th, 1818. But it's all maps. So it's interesting to me that she doesn't call this a book of geography. She calls it a book of penmanship because that's what she's practicing. So here you can see Massachusetts, and you can also see that she's doing the same thing. So here's Vermont, bordered by Lower Canada, New Hampshire, New York, and Massachusetts. And so one of the things that's interesting about her copybook and a whole bunch of maps, and anytime I talk about this, I present this mystery, because someone someday is going to know. One of the things that presents themselves in these maps across time and across state borders. So you see it in Vermont, you see it in Connecticut, you see it in Maine, you see it in Massachusetts, you see it in New Hampshire, wherever these young women are making these maps. They are often tied with blue bows. Not other color bows, blue bows. And it's before blue ribbon for like first prize. It's when light blue was more associated with young women than pink was, so that may be part of it. But the visual language of the decorations are traveling. And so the interesting part about this is that the young women who are learning these crafts at academies, who then become teachers, are taking what they learned and spreading it throughout New England from school to school to school. And so we can often trace it back to the origins. So it's happening a lot in Vermont because Emma Willard, the pioneering female educator, is in Vermont, and she's in Connecticut, and she's teaching map making. But you see this travel all over the place. This is a very funny letter in our collection from Eliza Langdon to her, to her dad, circa 1810. And it really gives us a window into what it was like to actually make these maps. So she's writing to her father. He was a minister in Newington, New Hampshire. She went to the Dow Academy with her sister Hannah. Hannah was sick with the flu, so she was writing to her dad. And at the bottom, she was telling him about her attempt to, quote, drawing a map of the world, with which I am much pleased, but it requires a considerable degree of patience. So we know from their own accounts that this was work that they were both proud of, so much so that they were writing home to their parents about it, but also that it was incredibly tedious. I mean, I'm the oldest of 6 kids. You look at how big these are. So you're doing them either by daylight or candlelight. Dipped quill, pen and ink. You know, one brother shoving your arm and the thing go, there's no coming back from that. Like, you spill the ink, it's done. You start over. I mean, these took weeks and months. And in fact, these young women in these academies had exhibits every year at the end of term where they invited the townspeople. I'm really curious. I'm going to write a note to the archivist at the Berwick Academy, because the Berwick Academy is the oldest one in the state of Maine. And I'm really curious to see if they have any archives that go back to their 18th century founding and that actually talk about having these like community events. So women would showcase their painted furniture, music, they would do dancing, they would show their maps, and they would put them on display. And one of the reasons why we still have so many of these, this one is one of my favorite in our collection. This is Hannah Comstock's Map of the World from Danbury, Connecticut. She was 14 when she drew this. I always say this to my students. You know, you get assignments that you like, and you get assignments that you hate, and you get assignments where you like one part but not another. Hannah Comstock does not like geography. If you look at her, like, her lines are terrible. Hannah Comstock loves botanical drawing. Her leaves are exquisite. They're 3 different colors of green, carefully tied with a blue bow. You can see it again in Connecticut. And she loves drawing flowers. So there's a lot of violets on this map, which stand for modesty and faithfulness. So young women in these academies are also being taught virtues. That's what they're copying in their penmanship books. And they are taking the flowers that represent these virtues, and they're putting them on the map. This is a beautiful one from New Hampshire. This is Susan Bartlett from Warner, New Hampshire. Her grandfather was a signer of the Declaration of Independence, and governor of New Hampshire, Josiah Bartlett. So again, like a well-off young woman whose family believed and could afford education. But her map of the world, you can see all of the penmanship flourishes she's practicing. She draws the eagle and the symbology of the United States and makes this absolutely beautifully rendered map. And these persist in the same way that you save the best stuff that your kids did. They were often framed, they were often on rollers. Many of the ones we have a lot of light damage and some water damage, knowing that they were hung on a family's wall for years. Or the young woman would take them into their classroom. Like if they became a teacher, they would then use the map as a teaching tool for their own students. And that first one I showed you, that Emily Hill map, that's what we really think that map was made for a classroom rather than her project as a young student. This is Martha Fulton's map of the world done in Philadelphia in 1832. What a unique part about this map in our collections is that it's still stitched with the silk binding that it was originally bound with. And on the back is a page from the New York Observer. So even if the map wasn't dated, it helps us date it. And so you can see that this was sort of framed and hung over time. The Mrs. Martin School in Portland, Maine was very well known for their decorative work. It was a school from about 1804 to 1849. The Mrs. Martins, there were 3 of them, sisters. They taught over 500 boarding school and day students during the years that they were open. And this one is done by Hannah Little, and this is of Portland, Maine, just a year before Maine becomes a state. And what I find really fascinating about this one, and I'll show you some more examples from Mrs. Martin's, one of the things that I've been talking a lot about with these maps is that whatever else they're learning, they're bringing into this work. So she's practicing her stitching through drawing. The whole seam of the map looks like embroidery. So does the border of the title. If you look at a penmanship exercise from Mrs. Martin's school at the same time by another young woman, you can see that the style of what they're being taught doesn't just show up in specimens of penmanship, but also on the map. That very detailed, fancy border. The Mrs. Martin School, this is Harriet Cutter's Lily and Rose. This is at Maine Historical. It's spectacular. Her father was the mayor of Portland from 1834 to 1840. She makes this in 1814. It is embroidery and hand-painted silk. The young woman is hand-painted silk. It's like 16 different types of stitches. It is an unbelievable piece of needlework art done by a 15-year-old, right? So this is what they're learning, right? And this is what they're taking the time to do. And it's not just in Portland. So these academies were founded by cities and towns all over what becomes the state of Maine, often before Maine was a state. Gorham, where I live, founds its academy in 1803, and it's opened by 1806. And academies were built for post-grammar school education. So they're roughly the equivalent of high schools. They're not really college. They are preparing to send students off to college. But the academies flourish. There are dozens across the state of Maine, including the one literally across the street, because this is what the opportunity is. Some are for young women, some are for young men. Gorham's was mixed from the beginning. In 1806, when it had its first class, it was just men. In 1807, it was men and women, right? That's not always true. It depends on the town, what they're doing, but oftentimes there were female seminaries and male academies opened in the same town. They're incredibly popular, but they're dependent on tuition. When free high school becomes a thing that really takes root in the 1860s and 1870s, most academies don't make it. Because why would you pay to send your child to an academy when they could go for free? And it becomes a much more democratic form of education. The Coney Female Academy, founded by Judge Coney, is a little bit different. They have a lot of scholarships for young women of all ranges of socioeconomic family wealth. So their maps from Coney aren't world maps. They are maps of the United States. Their assignment was drawing maps of Maine. And we know, so this is the one in our collections, and again, this is a huge wall map. This was done in 1822 by Sarah N. Young. We know that she's copying from Moses Greenleaf's very well-known map of the District of Maine. But this is Maine Historicals. And this is Susan E. Church's map of the state of Maine, Coney Female Academy, 1822, 1826. So we know that these assignments persisted over time. But we also know that at the Coney Female Academy, because we have newspaper advertisements for their curriculum, women were being offered instruction in orthography, reading and writing, arithmetic, grammar, rhetoric and composition, geography, history and chronology, natural history, natural philosophy and astronomy, use of the globes, drawing maps, and also drawing, penciling, and painting, and a variety of needlework. And indeed, that's exactly what survives, is what they made. So this is Mary Swan's sampler from 1828. Her father, Benjamin Swan, was a leading clockmaker in Maine. I just wanted to show you, like, she has a very artistic eye, but like this is what she was seeing at home. This is what her father made, right? These exquisite, exquisite tall case clocks and the painted faces. So many of you have probably read A Midwife's Tale from Martha Ballard. So this is Martha Ballard's granddaughter, Dolly Pollard. This is her sampler from Coney Female Academy in 1820, the year Maine became a state. And she mentions her grandmother right in the top section where she sort of lists out her family register and then decorates it the same way that these women would decorate maps. So just like you saw Susanna Rowson's Academy in Boston, Berwick Academy has a very similar picture. This is from 1855. It's a very small hand-colored print. Berwick was founded in 1791. And so map making isn't happening absolutely everywhere. Some schools specialize in one thing over another. But it is happening to an incredible extent at these female academies, particularly in the 18th and 19th century. And we know even through reward of merits, that were little prizes that teachers gave students at the end of term. This is a particularly lovely one. This is a hand-drawn and watercolored reward of merit made in 1823 from New York. But it's presented to Miss Mariah Davis for having finished her appointed task in geography. So maybe it was a map, maybe it was a copybook, but we know this is what women were doing. By the time you get to the War of 1812, you have much more of a shift on, you've gone through the early republic, the United States has been formed. You start to see more and more young women drawing maps of the United States. So Eliza Elvira Whiting of Winthrop, Maine, finished this on August 16th in 1812. She was 14 when she made this map. If you look at her Atlantic Ocean, every one of those lines is hand-drawn. There's thousands of them, one on top of the other, rendering the ocean. And then all of the color is hand-applied. But a cool thing is that we can actually, just like we can find the atlases and the maps that they're copying from, we can also find the exact penmanship books they would have been using to practice their font. So this is Eliezer Huntington. It's a Hartford textbook about the art of penmanship, or a new and improved system of the round and running hand. And when you look through this copy and you start looking at the letters, particularly the German text, and then you look at her map, she's using the German text from this penmanship book. So it's really fun to figure that out, right? To know what students are using in school. And there's at least 5 different fonts on any of these maps. This is from Marshfield, Massachusetts. Olive Little says she projects this map of the United States. It's a beautiful wall map from our collection. This is from Mary Hall, closer to here, from Alfred, Maine, a map of the northern part of the United States and the northern part of Canada. She was 16 when she made this. But what's really interesting about this map, if you look in the corner when you see it, it says lift the flap, which Mary Hall didn't write. And underneath it says, drawn by my grandmother Sayward Mary Hall when a child at Alfred about 1814, E.L. Sayward, 1914. So here was a granddaughter who had inherited her grandmother's map and kept it and actually marked when it was made by making this funny underleaf to tell you. And she does write in ink, sadly, on top of the map, lift the flap. But it's really neat when students can kind of do that and see and figure out what these women were doing. This is a rather unfinished one, but it's also bound in silk, but she was 11. I have an 11-year-old. He can make a map that looks nothing like that. There's no way. They don't have the patience or the inclination. But you can see even from a very young age. And it's part of becoming, women can't vote. They're not considered citizens of the United States. They don't have a voice in the political economy. But drawing these maps of the United States are a way in which they can sort of showcase their patriotism. And it's also a way you can travel without leaving, right? In the sense of you drawing yourself as part of this burgeoning United States. There's one other form of map that I just want to show you because they're very sweet. They're allegorical maps that these young women also make. This is very small. This was done in the Mount Vernon School in Boston in 1833. Abigail Tufts Frothingham Purley. And this is a map of matrimony. And so it's very funny. It's talking about spinsterhood, that's like the black area at the top. There's like motherly love on here. It talks about courtship. So you can see what a 16-year-old girl would have been thinking about, right? Because this is teaching women to be Republican mothers, right? To educate their young men into the outside civic world, right? So you can see that part of this are these virtues that she's picking up. So as you think about these maps, and schoolboys made maps too. We have one of Winslow Homer made this when he was 10 in 1846. It's in our collection. His signature at 10 is almost exactly his signature as an adult artist. It's really remarkable. So that's a pencil sketch map he made of Great Britain, and you can see there, it's really beautifully rendered for a 10-year-old. Here's another, this is George Babbitt's map of the southern states in 1866 at the end of the Civil War. But the fonts that the men are practicing are different because men and women are taught different penmanship throughout much of the late 1700s and early 1800s. Men are taught the penmanship of the profession which they're going to assume. Clerks, surveyors, lawyers, all have different hands. Women are being taught the penmanship of running a household, correspondence, fancy work, calligraphic, decorative. That shifts in the 20th century, right? But in the 18th and 19th, it's really interesting. You can see it on the map. I mean, this one is very plain, block. It's not ornate. And it's not because George Babbitt wasn't capable of it. It's because that's not what he was being taught in the same way. And so just to kind of wind up this evening and thinking about schoolgirl maps, we really can't, I'm going to just end with Emma Willard, who wrote next to the Bible and Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin, which was the best-selling book of the 19th century. So hers is like number 3. Her American history textbook sells millions of copies throughout the United States. And since she's very young, she's working on improving female education. And she's arguing that it's the duty of the government, in order to promote the prosperity of the nation, to educate women, because it's women who are going to raise these future citizens and leaders. And so she's always arguing for equal education. She's doing this in Connecticut, in Vermont, in Massachusetts, and finally in New York, because in Vermont they won't open the school that she wants. So she moves to New York and she opens the Troy Female Seminary, which is now called the Emma Willard School. This is the first school within the United States, her school, to offer higher education to women, post-high school. Smith opens in 1871, Wellesley in 1875, Radcliffe in 1879. She opens her school in 1821, 50 years before any of these. This is what it looks like. This is the Troy Female Seminary. So Emma Willard wrote these beautiful atlases to go along with her textbook. And she argues, in history, I have invented the map, because she maps time in really interesting ways. So she brings together all of these visual mnemonics to help students remember history and chronology. So you sometimes see it as a great tree. Her most famous image is probably the Temple of Time from 1846, which is spectacular. Like, it is a massive timeline of ancient to modern history, all done in a fashion where a student could memorize it visually. This is what map drawing is in the 19th century. It gets watered down considerably over time, so that by the time you get to the 1940s, this is just another piece from our collection, I'll end with this, is that this is what's most likely to be done in the geography classrooms by the 1940s. You have stencil maps where you put this on top of a piece of paper, you poke your pencil in the dot, you take off the pencil, you connect the states, you might write the names in them. There are special map coloring crayons. We have some examples from the 30s and 40s in our archive. But you go from thinking what this students are capable of is this, from 100 years earlier, these spectacular displays of geography, artistry, and penmanship. So I would argue it's time to bring map drawing back. For the good of the Republic, but even just for the simple knowing of geography, right? There is something about drawing and putting hand to paper that helps you retain that information. I love my computer, my phone's great, but I still take handwritten notes because I don't remember it unless I do that. And so I think that practice, this speaks a lot to that practice. And students are really inspired and often shocked when they see what students far younger than them made 200 years ago with no technology at their disposal. So thanks very much. I will leave it there. Special thanks to the projector for staying on. Yes. That's a great question. So we have in our collections examples of young women making maps, particularly in France and French Canada and English Canada, and also England, but particularly with young men. So we have some beautiful geography notebooks from the early 19th century that were done at schools and academies in England. So we for sure know that this map drawing was being taught with some frequency across Europe. It looks a little different. So like the discipline, and you really see it, I should mention, we have a massive collection of geography textbooks dating back to the 1700s. But you can see the instructions, particularly in the mid to late 19th century, that the map drawing is right in the textbook. So we could often trace, even with textbooks that were from England or from France, that they're also teaching this. But the style of schoolgirl maps is a little bit more ornate and elaborate in the United States, but we absolutely have examples from France and Great Britain too. So it's not unique to the United States, but it's more practiced in female academies here than it is elsewhere. But that's a great question. So we do have evidence of it being elsewhere too. Other questions? Look in your attic. See if you have great-grandma's schoolgirl map in there. I know there must be so many more than the ones that come on the market. And sometimes people find them and bring them to us as well. But I think it was a far more ubiquitous practice than we even realize. It's just what persists, what persists through time. And I really think, like, in terms of recovering the academic learning of women in the early 1800s, these are sort of what we have. We don't have a lot of essays that women wrote. They didn't really save those to the same extent. We have the visuals, we have the needlework, the embroidery, the samplers, right? You've seen probably 1,000 samplers. But these were all being done at the same time. So they tell us more about the rich curriculum that these women were actually learning. And when it moves into the public schools, they keep drawing maps, but it's much more rote. They get grids, they draw and trace on the grids. They're no longer these elaborate works of art. But they're lovely, so keep your eyes open for them. Yeah.
I taught geography for a number of years, but one of the things that I was looking at was the amount of planning that had to go into before you started, because some of these were color, and I can't imagine running out of a color and then trying to match it exactly.
Oh, that's a great question. We work with a lot of art educators, and we think a lot about process in these maps, and my friend Susan is really digging into that, because you're right, like, most of these are a watercolor wash, but this is a particularly good example, this one of Olive Little. Like, that's a very particular darker green that she's using. Yeah, and also some you can see are freehand, some you can see the needles from a compass, some you can see pencil underneath, but most you can't. And so I think that's a great point, that planning. What's going down first? The grid, the outline, then the rivers, and then depending on how dark the wash is some of the black ink labeling going over the wash or underneath it? No, it really is, I think. And looking at that is interesting because some of the ones they're filling in, and some of the ones are just done in that outline form. And the styles tend to tell you a little bit about where they are. Like, if we found other maps from Alfred, Maine that were made during this time, they would probably look a lot like this.
They absorb it at a different, so even to be able to smooth that out, watercolor is amazing.
Oh, and these ones, this is an incredible work of art because every line in the column is a different color. And so you really, they really pop out to you when you see them. But you're right, and this was the last piece we had of hers. And you can look at her earlier stuff, and it's good. But it's nothing like this one. But you can see she was practicing this for 5 years before she did her showpiece to really prove what she had mastered. So yeah, thank you for pointing that out. I mean, it's really incredible skill and time and patience, like that poor girl in New Hampshire writing to her dad. And she was like a reverend's daughter, so you know that she had exercises in patience growing up as a child, sitting through many sermons, right? But she's like, Dad, I just can't with this map right now. My sister has the flu, and I'm still making this map. Because I think we had students, when we had this exhibit up, art students do dipped pen work just with the handwriting book. It took them 45 minutes to make one letter. And so then they were looking and saying, like, wow. I mean, the amount of time that these young women would have put into this work, it really gave them, like, a distinct sense of perspective.
Just to comment on the last thing about you still write. 2 years ago, there was actually a report out that when students are typing on the computer, they're missing part of the lesson, and that actually writing by hand reinforces the learning as one of the elements of the learning.
If students take notes at all, I would even, right, like that's what, even in teaching college, for the past 20 plus years, it's remarkable. I mean, I have notebook after notebook from college. I'll ask some of my graduating seniors on Monday. I'm teaching a senior seminar. I'll be like, how many notebooks do you have from college? They'll probably be like, none. Because they're never sitting and taking notes in that way, very rarely.
And they don't know how to hold
They don't even know how to address an envelope, but we will not get into that. Libby, is this where the stamp goes? You're 32. Yes, this is where the stamp goes. No, I knew I have to teach penmanship. I have to teach how to read cursive. In 2016, I had to start teaching mail, which is really remarkable to me. But it's like a loss of this. But drawing is very popular again, even among very young kids. Like all my 11-year-old friends draw extensively. And you can owe a lot of that to graphic novels, because that's so much of what they're reading and drawing and then trying their hand at doing it. So that's nice, at least some, right? Written work again. But it's scary.
I always wrote them top 10, and the students would like to hold them, and they always want to.
With big ink stains. But they're fascinated by the tools of this. And I think that's why, we saw 100 college classes this semester in the map library of all disciplines. It's a remarkable amount. And I think part of that is how much students enjoy the real thing. We had the Nuremberg Chronicles out on Monday night for one of my classes from 1493. And they're sitting down and they're like flipping through it. And they're like, so this isn't the real one. I'm like, no, this is the 1493. And they were like, so 1 year after Columbus. I was like, yeah, that's what you're touching. So there is like a fascination with the real and the hand done that's really coming back, which is really gratifying. And we're hoping that it will prompt more of an interest in history and geography. But we had a whole art class presenting their final projects in the map library this morning, maps that they had drawn, personal narrative maps. They're beautiful. But it was really incredible to hear them talk about like what they had seen in our collection and then how that little piece had inspired a piece of their map. So we're getting people back to map drawing. It may look a little different, but it's happening again. So, and having these that people can look at really helps to like connect the thread between students over time. It's really fun. Come see them in person. They're lovely. And happy to chat over anything else you have outside too. Other questions? Okay. Thank you. All right, now we can look at Now it's safe.